Right, guys, Cosmic Summiters, please find your seat, or someone else's seat, don't really mind. We got two amazing speakers now coming at you back to back before lunch. So if you'd like to shuffle back. Oh, and a reminder to those watching on the live stream, I know we got like 1,000 odd people watching live from all over the world. Remember that if you would like to enter questions for the Q&A, pop them in the comments. We've got some guys who are all over the live stream and they're sending your qualified Q&As questions to my phone. So keep throwing them in. Cool. Everyone's coming in. Okay, guys. So our third speaker of the day, I'm so excited to introduce. I met this gentleman this week and was so lucky to have dinner last night. A group of us were able to have dinner with Dr. Collins, and he just started riffing about Akhenaten and Moses and Tutankhamun, and I was like, I need to write this down. This is a movie in the making. I've never heard this story spun in this way before. So he's absolutely going to blow your socks off. Dr. Collins, for 16 seasons, he served as the dig director of el-Hamman, a cultural mound in the Jordan Valley. He's the writer of the most read scientific paper in the world. His excavation of the site has uncovered the Levant's largest city of the Middle Bronze Age and identified it as the best candidate for the historical city of Sodom. As a man of faith, author, and respected academic scholar, he's a real sought-after lecturer, so we are completely lucky to have him here today. He's an excellent speaker, and he's about to give a mind-bending talk, so please give a huge round of applause for Dr. Stephen Collins!
Well, a couple of shameless advertisements here. One is this book, Discovering the City of Sodom, that we wrote back in 2013. By the way, it came out exactly the same week as the Chelyabinsk airburst. So I don't know, I emailed my co-author and I said, wow, does Simon & Schuster have connections or what? But anyway, and then one more little thing, and I'm just going to make this quick, but coming up in September, we have the International Symposium on Archaeology in the Bible 8. Fantastic event with all the top scholars that deal with those subjects, whether people of faith or not. And it's isabq.org. And so if you want to connect up with us for September, that's the date for that. Now, for the rest of this, I'm going to be very, very strict with myself because I am an inveterate rabbit chaser. I love going down into rabbit holes. I love, and my students know if they can get me going off in a particular direction, I'll drive it to the core of the earth if I have to. I just like to do that. But for our purposes today, I'm going to be very, very strict with myself. In fact, so strict that I usually have lots of movements and animations in my PowerPoints, and I actually had to go through and conk out a lot of those because it takes that little bit of extra time that I am not going to have with 150 slides. So I'm going to be pretty stiff with this. I'm going to read my abstract for this presentation because it sort of sets the tone. And I know this is a lot of text, and we're going to do this a couple of times today, but I think it sets the tone. So-called biblical archaeology can be long on speculation, short on facts, and colored grotesquely by theological predispositions. Not a few scholars consider biblical archaeology conceptually biased and incapable of contributing to a realistic understanding of ancient Near Eastern history. Unfortunately, some of these sentiments are correct. But the astute archaeological scholar knows full well that the dominant conventional theories of Old Testament Torah textual origins are themselves highly speculative in nature and founded on presuppositions we now know to be false, aka fictions. There is, however, a proper scientific methodology by which one can approach the relationship, if any, between biblical text and ancient Near Eastern archaeology and history. I call this historical synchronisms and material specificity approach. As much as is humanly possible, and this has been stated multiple times in this conference, as much as is humanly possible, the HSMSA avoids speculation and focuses only on factual data in ascertaining the relationship between texts and physical reality. I present the Genesis-Sodom narratives as a model for the application of the HSMSA, by which said narratives are demonstrated to be consistent with all the known and testable facts relevant to the case. Now, this is going to be a sprint, but I'm going to start with Walt Rast, who is the excavator of the traditional site that most people think is the city of Sodom toward the south into the Dead Sea. Here's what Walt says. He says, although certain scholars earlier in this century, in the 19th century, argued to locate Sodom and its related cities at the north end of the Dead Sea, recent scholarship has generally placed the cities at the south end of the Dead Sea Valley. While both Albright and Lapp concluded that Babadra was indirectly connected with ancient Sodom as a cult center for the so-called cities of the plain, they also assumed that Sodom and the related cities in the biblical accounts lay buried below the waters of the south into the Dead Sea. Of course, that hypothesis has been thoroughly knocked in the head recently, since the Dead Sea levels have dropped so severely that the entire southern Dead Sea basin dried up decades ago, and there isn't a sherd of pottery down there. Why would anybody build a city, town, or even a village in a sump that fills up with water every time you get a substantial rain? It was a silly idea to begin with. But let's continue. Walt Rast says, the accounts in Genesis show that the location of Sodom was only generally perceived by the Israelites as lying somewhere in the Dead Sea region. Two possibilities exist. One is that Sodom was a fictional place name to begin with, that a city by this name never existed, but came into being as an element in a local story or a tale, stressing, and this is the part I want to emphasize, a destruction severe enough to account for the startling physiography of the Dead Sea region. Mulder, similar to Rast, says, usually it is thought that these cities were situated on the south coast of the Dead Sea, but there is no agreement in the biblical record concerning their exact position. I would somewhat disagree with that, as you will see. Because the topography in the Hebrew Bible is extremely vague, and I'm going to dispel that notion as well, it was possible to look for the Pentapolis also on the north coast of the Dead Sea, in a place called El Gor, in the vicinity of the outlet of the Jordan River into that sea. So he at least admits the possibility. He continues, but it's highly uncertain, if not improbable, that the vanished cities of the Pentapolis will ever be recovered. Still, on the whole, it is by no means impossible that a big catastrophe in prehistoric times did live on in the memory of the peoples living around the Dead Sea, and that later on the essential features of the tradition were taken over by the Israelites, and of course finding their way into the book of Genesis, chapters 13 through 19. Well, given that neither Walt Rast, nor Mulder, nor Albright, nor Lapp, nor any other southern Sodom proponent, for that matter, provided an adequate analysis of the relevant geographical texts for the cities of the plain, what in the world did they rely on to arrive at their conclusion about Sodom's location? Well, what I find is essentially they pondered their own assumptions and the assumptions of others, while virtually avoiding the relevant texts and the proper scientific and historiographical analyses that could reasonably ascertain the veracity or fictionality of the narrative components. They just didn't do their homework or their due diligence. In fact, they also assumed that the conventional wisdom of archaeology about the Dead Sea region settlements was correct. But it was anything but correct. They operated with erroneous assumptions about the Dead Sea region settlements and still influenced today's most used maps, perpetuating the same critical errors and omissions, as I will show you. Here's one. Now look at this. Is an early Bronze Age site map done by my good friend Anson Rainey, who passed away a few years ago. But he was agreed to be the most important biblical or historical geographer of the southern Levant, or of the regions involved in the biblical narratives, in his book called The Sacred Bridge. This is Carta's 2015 version of it. And you can see that right there north of the Dead Sea, on the east side of the Jordan River, it's blank. There are no cities, towns, or villages listed there. Here's the intermediate Bronze Age site map for the period of about 2500 down to about 2100 BC. Look it's blank except for a little town called Iktanu, and we now know that is one of our satellite towns. But look how blank it is. Here's the Middle Bronze Age site map, taking in the time from 2100 down to about 1600 BC. The map is blank. What do we do with that? Is there nothing there? Yes, there is. This is the archaeological site map of this same area as the result of several decades of analysis, of surveys, and mostly because of the Tal el-Hammam excavation project, which I've directed for since 2005. Now, that's a little bit different. I mean, how do we go from that to that? So when you realize that 6 fortified Babadras, remember Babadra is the city that so many people believe is Sodom and located toward the south into the Dead Sea. When you think that 6 fortified Babadras could fit inside of Tal el-Hammam's fortified perimeter with room to spare, the omission of critical archaeological data from the Sodom discussion looms minimally as unfortunate and perhaps egregious. I think the latter is more descriptive. So what gets us from here, a blank, to here, a quite crowded civilization center on the eastern side of the Jordan River north of the Dead Sea? How do we go from one to the other? Well, here's what I generally say, and this is a little goad to some of my archaeological friends. If in the past archaeologists and Bible scholars had taken the Sodom tales seriously and paid closer attention to the abundant geographical details embedded in the relevant biblical texts, they would have discovered the marvelous civilization in the biblical land of the Kikar. And by the way, that's what the biblical text calls it. Haaretz HaKikar, the land of the Kikar. They would have discovered it a long time ago. But they didn't pay attention to it, and they didn't discover it. But guess what? We happened to pay attention to it, and lo and behold, we did discover it. And so we have to realize that we need to analyze objectively the testable components of a given narrative. Let me say this. There is no such thing as a fictitious geography in the ancient Near East. There's no such thing as Middle Earth or 5-acre wood in the writings of the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Hittites, the Sumerians, anybody. They don't make up fictitious geography. Now, you can dispute whether the characters and the storylines of the stories they write are fact or fiction, but all of their stories, fact or fiction, are layered over a real-world geography, and it's a testable geography. So we have to test that geography scientifically, and we can't rely on assumptions or hypotheses about the narrative. I find that people want to talk about it and around it. They don't want to actually read the narrative and mine out the geographical facts. This means taking the narrative at face value after a rigorous examination of its lexicography, its phenomenology, grammar and syntax, and all the related things that go with that. So, what does the biblical text actually say about the location of Sodom and the cities of the plain? What does it actually say? Well, I'm going to take you to Genesis chapter 13. And this is a remarkable text. And by the way, I always say that the stories in the book of Genesis, whether it's the flood stories or the Tower of Babel story, whether it's the Abraham story, these are all snapshots, pericopes, snapshots of much, much larger, longer, more detailed events. It's like writing the history of the United States in one 15-sentence paragraph. Can you do it? Of course you can do it, but it might make it look like Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy were somehow almost near contemporaries, because you have to conflate so many things together. But this is what's happening. These are very, very brief sketches of much wider, larger, longer event scenarios. But why Genesis 13? Well, Genesis 13 is the only narrative passage in the entire Bible where the Sodom tales are marked out for a specific location. In fact, this passage is specifically written to take the reader to the city of Sodom geographically. It therefore is the only primary geographical text on the location of Sodom found in the Bible, because that's the very purpose of its writing, is to take you to the city itself. So here it is. Now, I've cut out the incidentals. I've left in the geography, so where you see the ellipses, there's other stuff in there, but I want to just grab on to the geographical details. It says, so Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev, and Lot went with him. From the Negev, he went from place to place until he came to Bethel, to the place between Bethel and Ai. Lot looked up and saw that the whole plain of the Jordan was well watered, like the garden of Yahweh, like the land of Egypt, towards Zoar. I think it's Zoan, but that's another discussion. So Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan and set out toward the east. Abram lived in the land of Canaan, while Lot lived among the cities of the plain and pitched his tents in the Hebrew Ad Sodom, as far as Sodom or near Sodom. Now, let's look at this. In this passage, the word plain appears 3 times. Now, the word plain in Hebrew, or low place, or valley bottom, or bottom land, there are 4 essential words to do this in Hebrew. Bika, Emek, Mishor, Arava. But it's interesting that this word translated plain in Genesis 13 is not any of these. It's not one of the standard Hebrew words for valley, plain, or lowland. So what is it? It's the Hebrew word Kikar. Kikar in Hebrew means a disc or a circle. It's used 68 times in the Old Testament. Over 50 times, it means simply a talent of metal, which is a flat, circular ingot of metal, a disc, or a flat, circular loaf of bread. In New Mexico, where I come from, that's a no-brainer. It's called a tortilla, right? I think you have Taco Bell out here, so you get the idea. So talents or tortillas, that's essentially what the word Kikar means. In fact, if you go to Jerusalem today and do a traffic roundabout, and you look at the sign associated with it, it will say Kikar. The Kikar this, Kikar that. It's a circle, it's a disc. The word's used in every other ancient Near Eastern language. Akkadian, it's kakaru. In Ugaritic, it's kakaru. In Egyptian, it's kirkir. In fact, kirkir actually means in Egyptian literally to draw a circle in the sand with a stick. That's what that means. Now, that's my traffic circle thing. I didn't know that was coming. Outside the Old Testament passages, Kikar, and now this is a point. Outside the Old Testament, the word Kikar in no other context in any ancient Near Eastern language carries a geographical application at all. It's never applied geographically in any other ancient textual source, only 13 times in the Bible. So these 13 geographical uses of Kikar are found only in the Old Testament, and they refer to the disc-shaped southern Jordan Valley north of the Dead Sea. It's phenomenological. They call it that because it looks like that. And remember, it's the cities of the plain, and it's the plain of the Jordan. Those are important points. Now here's the Jordan River coming down from the north and through its rather narrow valley, and then that valley just north of about 25 kilometers north of the Dead Sea opens out into a much wider floodplain. And this is obviously the Kikar of the Jordan. That's the disk. We call it a phenomenological secondary referent. In New Mexico, we have things called mesas. They're flat-topped hills. Why do we call them mesas? Because the Spanish word for table is mesa. It looks like a table. We call it a mesa. This looks like a disc. If you stand in the middle of it and you do a 360, you see the narrow hills to the north, the narrowing of the hills around the Dead Sea to the south, and you see this wide plain opening around you, and you can turn a 360 and see the green all around you. It is a green disc. It is, in fact, one of the best watered places in that area. Hayarden, the word Jordan, by the way, in the Bible, it's never Jordan River. It's just Hayarden. It means the descent, or the descending of what? Of the terrain and the fresh water it directs down into this great rift valley all the way to the Dead Sea. And when Hayarden, the Jordan, reaches the Dead Sea, which is, by the way, the lowest spot on the surface of the earth, about 1,300 feet below sea level, the descent terminates. Do you suppose that the descending would terminate when it hits the lowest spot on the face of the earth? Yes, it can't go any further. It's over. It terminates, and thus Hayarden, the Jordan, ends. This is the strict biblical and geological conception of Hayarden. And the Kikar of the Jordan, therefore, is north of the Dead Sea because A, Hayarden never refers to anything other than the Jordan River proper, and B, Hayarden never includes any part of the valley of Sodom or the Dead Sea Valley, but ends at the mouth of the Jordan, at the bay of the Dead Sea below Pisgah. And what does that look like on a map? Well, we'll show you in a second. Hayarden is that descent of the fresh water, the living water. Yam Hamela is the sea of salt. It's a basin of dead water. The ancient people separated these two things very clearly. And this is where it is. See where Pisgah is, the mouth of the Jordan below Pisgah, where the Kikar of the Jordan terminates. It's north of the Dead Sea. It's a geographical no-brainer. The Kikar of the Jordan was well watered, according to our text, like the Garden of Yahweh. How was that? A river running right down the middle of it, and springs, ground springs. And B, like Egypt. How is Egypt watered? Annual river inundations that deposit layers of silt, and they plant in the receding waters, in the silt as the waters recede after the flood season. And that's what drove Nilotic civilization for 3,000 years. So, what the writer of the passage is saying is that the Jordan, the Hayarden, the Kikar of the Jordan, is like a little Nile in miniature. It's a little small version of it hydrologically. It is virtually identical. And here it is. This is the best watered agriscape in the region. You see Jericho on the west side, because there's a big spring at Jericho, and that's why the city is there. But on the east side, there are springs everywhere. If I put all the springs in, you wouldn't be able to see anything but yellow. The stars represent the springs that are in the area. The Transjordan Aquifer disgorges most prolifically in this area. My good friend Anson Rainey, before he passed away, and which is being published in Kikar Dialogues, he says, it is usually ignored that the term Araba applies to the Jordan Valley north of the Dead Sea. Too bad the author there did not use the term Kikar. The map in the atlas, the one we just showed you, the Sacred Bridge, does need revision, and Genesis 13 has to do with the high ground east of Bethel. The references to the Kikar fit better with the area north of the Dead Sea, and Anson Rainey was finally beginning to realize this and was willing to change the book, but passed away before that could happen. But the fact of the matter is that from where Lot was standing, he lifted up his eyes and saw what he saw. the entire Kikar of the Jordan. He lifted up his eyes and saw that the entirety of the Jordan Valley, the Kikar of the Jordan, was well watered. And in fact, the entire Kikar is visible from the highlands edge east of Bethel and Ai. We excavated at Ai for 6 seasons, and we know what you can see from there. And you can see, if you go especially over toward the Scarp, you can see the entirety of the Kikar north of the Dead Sea. Now, the Dead Sea is running here. The south is to the right. The north is to the left. The Kikar is there at the north of the Dead Sea. Bethel and Ai is located exactly right there. You cannot see the Dead Sea. You cannot see down because of the hills. And on a good day, you can just catch the north end of the Dead Sea. But what you can see is the entire circle of the Jordan Valley north of the Dead Sea. That's what the visibility is. And that's where Lot was standing when he lifted up his eyes. And then it says Lot traveled eastward from Bethel and Ai, pitching his tent as far as Sodom. Well, again, here's Bethel and Ai. He goes eastward and pitches his tent as far as Sodom. So, Sodom can only be here. It can only be there. And by the way, it has to be a certain distance from the river because of the annual inundations. And so it cannot be, it has to be somewhere there, which is why our theoretical map is built in this way. It cannot be in the Dead Sea region at all. And by the way, there isn't a single site in the Dead Sea region that dates to the time of Abraham, which, as we'll see, is the Middle Bronze Age. And every site in the southern Dead Sea region in that area of the Dead Sea was destroyed at least 2500 BC, which is at least 5 or 6 centuries prior to any possible date for the time of Abraham culturally. And so in that area, guess what we find? There are, in fact, ancient roadbeds. These yellow lines represent the ancient roadbeds as they actually exist, and there are cities there, and they have names. In the Bible, they're called Sodom and Gomorrah and Admah and Zeboim. In archaeology, they're called Tal el-Hammam, Tal Kafrain, Tal Nimrin, Tal Zblibel, and Musta. And there are a bunch of other sites around too. We actually have named several of them. You see Hammam Village 1 and Hammam Village 2, HV1, HV2, Ramah, Moes, Azema, Iktanu, Barakat, Tahona, and other sites around. And by the way, you can see that so many of these ancient roads converge in that area. And of course, if you look at Jericho across the river, it's obvious why Jericho is there, right? Look at it. All the ancient roads going in every direction, the trade routes cross there. That's a good place for a city. And Tal el-Hammam is the same way on the other side of the river. So how in the world did everybody's archaeological maps wind up with blanks, no cities, towns, or villages east of the Jordan, north of the Dead Sea? How did that happen? Well, they didn't do a lot of research. The Genesis writer also assumes that Sodom was the biggest city on the eastern Jordan disk. How so? It's always listed first. It's the only one mentioned by itself, and King Bera, the king of Sodom, is the chief of all the other kings. He's the only one that has a voice in the story. So the cities of the plain in Genesis 10 take us all the way back to the beginnings of urbanization. It's really clear that in Genesis 10 we get the first urbanizing process of human beings for this era, and that's the early Bronze Age. It's well documented with the building of giant fortified cities. The Middle Bronze Age of Abraham is also well documented because the cultural amenities of the Abraham story don't belong before 1900 BC, and they don't belong after 1600 BC. They only belong to that time frame of the Middle Bronze Age, and specifically the Middle Bronze Age II period. So, if we're going to find Sodom, we have to find all of that. So, Sodom and the other cities of the Jordan disk would have to have occupations dating from the early Bronze Age through the Middle Bronze Age, minimally. So, that's the time frame for Sodom and the cities of the Jordan disk. And so here it is. Tal el-Hammam is the largest Bronze Age city on the eastern Jordan disk. and has all of that going for it. It has the early Bronze Age fully over its entire site footprint. It has the intermediate Bronze Age fully over its entire site footprint. It has the Middle Bronze Age too over the entirety of its site footprint. And then suddenly something happened. This was taken at the end of the 2023 season, just a couple of months ago. And you can see the well-watered plain of the Jordan in the background. You can see, if you knew what you're looking at, a little piece of the Dead Sea back there in the background. But you can see this is the palace. This is just the palace. And so this is the Middle Bronze II palace at the time of the Middle Bronze Age terminal destruction of the site. Here's a little overview of it. By the way, we were the first to fly a drone in Jordan. It was kind of a funny story. All the other archaeological digs had shipped in drones, and they were all stuck in customs for years because it was illegal. You couldn't put it on. Now, King Abdullah's winter palace is right on the next hill, and you can understand some of this, but so drones were not allowed. So in the 2020 season, we walked into the hotel on the first day that we arrived in Jordan for that dig season, and one of our volunteers came up, and he introduced himself, and he said, "Hi," and gave us his name, and he said, "I brought a drone." You what? I brought a drone. Okay, how did you get, please explain. He said, I just put it in my carry-on luggage and I went right through and I have a drone. Okay, now what do we do? Well, we had to make sure that we didn't get arrested or something happened, and so we had to report it to the Department of Antiquities. We had to get it all set up with the Department of the Interior. We had to jump through hoops. And, well, lo and behold, we then were asked to write the drone protocol, the new drone protocol for using a drone, and we wrote it, and we flew it. And now yeah, pretty cool. And we donated the drone to the Department of Antiquities, and now other digs can use it. And we told the DOA, you can't charge us for it when we use it, but you can charge anybody else whatever you want. So I don't know how that works out, but people are using it. So anyway, we broke the ice for that, and perfectly accidentally. But all right, this is the palace compound. This is the upper city. Now, I don't have a lot of time to go into all the little nuances and details of it, but this is the upper city, and then we have a full lower city. The lower city is about 10 times bigger than the upper city. The upper city is where the rich people live. It's where the royal family, the ruling family lives, and this is their palace compound. We've been excavating this for 6 years, and I wish you had time to see a lot of it. We have something really interesting. These are surfaces of pottery vessels from the palace. We call it multi-slipped, cross-wiped palace ware. It is unique to Tal el-Hammam's palace. It's found nowhere else, anywhere in the Levant. In any other place, nobody has this decoration. It seems like the king of the palace at Sodom said, if you're going to serve me on a plate, or you're going to serve me, you're going to pour from a jug, or you're going to do anything in my palace, you better paint that thing. I don't want it looking like commonware. I don't want it looking like what everybody uses outside the palace. I want it to look special, and this is what the kind of thing they created. And we have a PhD student writing her doctoral dissertation right now on Tal el-Hammam's palace ware, and it's unique. It's not found anywhere else. Here's the southern defenses, and you can see that's the early Bronze Age defensive line. Then in the Middle Bronze Age, they beefed it up after a great earthquake. They immediately rebuilt and built the southern defenses. You can get a sense of the size of it just by the folks hanging around at the excavation. There's an entry into it. Here's Lane Rittmeyer's reconstruction of the city. We've been working on it for 16 years. And so you can see that we know pretty much where everything is. The palaces, the temple is in the middle of the lower city, and so on. The Great Gateway is there. Based on the excavations, this is the reconstruction of the gateway. It is fashioned, by the way, after a Minoan palatial estate. It's not a standard gate. It's a one-off. It's a unique gate. And we have many, many artifacts architecturally and stylistically, artistically, that connect us to the Minoan culture of Crete during the Bronze Age. Now, I'm going to jump into the destruction because that's really what this is kind of all about. And but we've just done, what have we done so far? If you're going to find a city, an ancient city that people have lost for some reason, you want to find it in the right place. You want to put it in the right time frame, right place, right time, right stuff, right? It says Lot sat in the gateway of Sodom. Well, guess what? That's a fortified city, has a gate, got to go in and out the gate. We found the gate. By the way, we also found the benches, the stone benches in which the people would sit inside the city gate. That was interesting. Right place, right time, right stuff. But there's also something that Dr. Phil Sylvia, our director of scientific analysis, who was also on the airburst paper, says there's a right story. And part of that right story has to do with the terminal destruction of the Middle Bronze Age city at Sodom. Now, I want to introduce something here. Ami Mazar is one of the premier archaeologists working in Israel. And he recently published this brand new publication that talks about destruction events, their identification, causes, and aftermath, some test cases. And in this, Ami Mazar writes some of the introduction, and he says this: destructions are highly visible in the archaeological record. They freeze a site at the moment of its existence and create a window into the dynamic past. The collapsed buildings, the broken vessels, and the objects on the floors, the layers of ashes and burnt wooden beams, all bear witness to the dramatic end of a settlement. But treating destruction as a single, isolable event in the history of a site is misleading. Destruction and abandonment phases should be placed within two larger frameworks. A, the site's temporal development, and B, wider social, political, cultural, and ideological context, given the ubiquity and prevalence of destruction layers in ancient Near Eastern tell sites. Now, I'm going to read this sentence again. This is really important. Listen to this. Given the ubiquity and prevalence of destruction layers in ancient Near Eastern tell sites, it is surprising that a systematic treatment of this phenomenon is largely neglected and that there is no conceptual paradigm for dealing with it. Can you imagine? Can you imagine? Every city, town, and village in the Near East is destroyed on average about every 100, 150 years. So you have just dozens and dozens of destructions, and nobody anytime has developed a way to systematically treat, to study, to deal with destruction layers, to analyze them. I find that's kind of interesting. Here's what Ami says. Again, destruction events undoubtedly had an enormous impact on human societies and their collective memory. In the Hebrew Bible, collective memories pertaining to destructions are numerous. Indeed, they are. Written records from the ancient Near East, such as Lamentations and other documents, recall such traumatic events. Archaeologists can reveal only the physical aspects of destructions. Much more research relating to this subject should be conducted in the future, and we are, I'd say, on the cutting edge of that. While destruction layers are commonly noted, they are rarely analyzed beyond scanty notations as to their general nature at the macro level. Fallen bricks, ash, charred wood. I tell you this, destruction layers up to this point are never, I say almost never, I would say categorically at this point, never analyzed at the micro level. You wonder why archaeologists are always irritated at you guys. Now I want to show you something. What thrust me into this arena? This thing. First penetration into the Middle Bronze Age at el-Hammam. How big is the site? We have over 1,300 6 by 6 meter squares on our site grid. Can you wrap your mind around that? 13,000 plus 6 by 6 meter squares on our site grid. It is now known, by the way, it was formerly unknown, even its existence, but now it's known as the largest continuously occupied Bronze Age site in the entire southern Levant. Interesting. In our very first penetration, in fact, it wasn't even an entire 6 by 6 meter square, it was a 2 by 2 meter sondage, probe. In the middle of that sondage, 3 meters down under the Iron Age, once we got underneath the Iron Age, we jumped back from 1000 BC to 1700 BC. There was a gap, an occupational gap of 700 years, and we found ourselves in the Middle Bronze Age. We knew we were there because I'm a ceramics expert. I mean, look at the pottery, I'll tell you where you are in time. And I'm looking down, so I looked down, and my assistant director had been excavating this probe, and she said, you better come down here and look at that. So I came down and I looked at that, and I saw this piece that you see on the left here. It's kind of glassy and shiny. It's melted, and it looks like glaze. And I looked at it, and I thought, well, maybe I can't say it in public what I said, but something to the effect that, oh, darn, what's a piece of 7th century AD Islamic pottery doing down here? So I picked it up and I looked at it, and I immediately recognized it as a type of Middle Bronze Age pottery that we had across the site, and I knew it was the sort of the neck, shoulder neck of a storage jar. I said, oh, it's Middle Bronze Age pottery. Well, I didn't know. It was weird. The surface is kind of melty, so I tossed it up. And the guy that caught it, his name's Gene Hall, who worked on the Manhattan Project and was there at the Trinity site when they blew up the first atomic bomb. And he grabbed it, and first thing out of his mouth was, this looks like trinitite. And I said, what's that? I never heard that word before. What's that? He said, you know, and I hate it when people do that. You like when people do that to you? You ask them a legitimate question. No, I don't know. That's why I'm asking you. He said, you know, it's the melted material sand silica at ground zero. You know, the heat of the blast melts it, and that's what they call it because it's the Trinity site, and it's named by Oppenheimer, by the way. And so that's what they call it, trinitite, melt product. And so I said, okay, you know, mark the registration and the locus number, put all the documentation on it, and it's going to go to the lab when we get back. And when we got to the lab, the lady who ran the test on it, Dr. David Burley, who was also on the airburst paper for el-Hammam, sliced it up and did all the preparation for the Kikar 100, glorified scanning electron microscope and all that analysis. And I had the extra piece, about the size of the palm of your hand. And so we walked in to watch the tests happening, and I handed it to the scientist doing the test, and she said to me, oh, nice piece of trinitite. It seems like everybody who sees this thing, nice piece of trinitite. Where did you get it? I said, flip it over. Oh, it's pottery. She said, where did this come from? Never mind, just do the test. And but I want to show you something. This is kind of interesting to me. Do you see this dark stuff, the black stuff? That's carbon separating out of the glass as it's being quickly melted. See all these other little nodules? That's calcium being separated out in little nodules out of the melt glass. That's a Middle Bronze Age 2 pottery sherd. Those are trinitite from ground zero at the Trinity site of the first atomic bomb explosion. Now you can see why people thought, wow, these things are physically very similar. Well, I'm not going to go into that because now we have to get into the micro. And I am not a physicist. I am not an astrophysicist. I'm an archaeologist. I look at the big stuff. I look at the mud bricks and the pottery and all of that stuff that I can see. And but if you want to read about all the details, This was published in 2001 in Nature Scientific Reports. A Tunguska, and you know that name, sized airburst destroyed Tal el-Hammam, a Middle Bronze Age city in the Jordan Valley near the Dead Sea. And you would not believe the pushback on that, but it is now maybe the most downloaded scientific paper in the history of scientific papers. It's pushing toward 1 million. It's pretty amazing. But, so you want to see the micro? Do that. I'm going to show you the macro. Now, what's the macro? This is my kind of deal. You walk into a room. Did you ever walk into a room? You walk into a room. You look down and you see Cheerios on the floor. And the further you look across to the other side of the room, the more Cheerios there are on the floor. And on the other side of the room, you see a large box of Cheerios. And you recognize the yellow box and all that. And it's a large box of Cheerios. And it's open. The top is open and the wrapper is open. And the corner of it is smashed in. The bottom corner of the box is crushed. And it's kind of lying there on the floor. And Cheerios are everywhere, banked up against the wall. Now, how do you interpret that scene? Does it take a CSI investigator really to figure out what went on here? This is not rocket science. You look at it and you go, somebody, for whatever reason, psychological anomaly, anger, whatever it was, walked in with a box full of Cheerios and threw it as hard as they could against the wall, smashing the corner, and it lands and hits and throws Cheerios everywhere. See, that's the kind of thing I can deal with. Okay? And you don't need an electron microscope to do this. This kind of stuff is obvious. And so I was told after that paper came out, we started observing something. It's actually not in the paper. Started observing something. We started observing that as we were looking at painted, highly decorated pottery vessels, and by the way, I'll spill a little bit of the beans here. In the palace area, in the central corridor, we have found not one out of 1,200 identifiable vessels broken. We have not found one single vessel either broken in place on the floor or on the floor, period. Nothing on the floor, everything up in 1 meter to 1.5 meters thick destruction matrix that we early on designated as the Cuisinart effect. Why? Because the entire matrix of destruction is full of broken bricks, broken plaster, broken people, broken pottery, crushed up, ground up pieces of everything that you would find for normal living. Just as if you took the whole city and you threw it into a blender and hit the button. And that's what it looks like. And so all of this pottery, these little pieces of pottery, are in the matrix from the bottom of it to the top of it and everywhere in between. And we're walking past the trays of the vessels, and I go, oh, I think this one goes to that one. And whoa, a join. They go together, and we start seeing more of this. Well, we started putting these things together, and then we started looking at the registration numbers. Oh, this one's from 5EE. This one's from 6FF. This one's from 7GG, talking about the squares. These were strewn over multiple meters, found in different seasons, in different loci, in different squares. How in the world does this happen? It's directionality. It's like the Cheerios scenario, only with ancient pottery from the palace. So, what's a typical observation? A typical observation is this is ash. Now, this is from our Iron Age destruction in about 830 BC. The Hazael Aramean destruction toward the end of Iron 2A, 2B period. And you see, this is typical. You find a jar smashed on the floor. Here's another couple of vessels smashed on the floor. And in fact, this is a field drawing in this area. You know, we had a saddle kern, a pyxis, a jar, a lamp, another jar, a jug, cooking pots, another cooking pot, basalt bowl, another basalt tray, a jar, basalt grinder, jar full of barley, jug, jar, bichrome jug. Where is all that stuff? It's in typical archaeological context. It's on the floor. Because when buildings fall down and earthquakes or destructions, they fall down and they cover things, smash things on the floor. But that's not the case. Here's earthquake destruction. This is from our site. We have two destructions. One in the EB23 transition, one in the IBMB1 transition. And the strike-slip motion of the African and Arabian plates in this location, they're both moving in the same direction. One's moving a little faster than the other, but the strike-slip motion is north-south. And so all of our earthquake events are throwing bricks and debris in a north-south orientation. Here's one particular side. Here's another one. And here's another one. You see the brick fall there and the brick fall there. We have identifiable destruction events. But this is looking at the palace, and I want you, do you see the line? Do you see this line? The entire city, lower city and upper city, this is all Middle Bronze Age stuff here. This is Middle Bronze Age wall, palace wall, interior wall, and that's the top of the destruction. That's the whole site looks like that at the top of the MB. When the Iron Age people got there, it was as flat as a pancake. The whole thing had been literally sheared off at a particular level. I'm talking about shearing walls 5 meters thick, 2.5 meters thick, 1 meter thick, just being sheared off at about this height. That's a whole other dynamic that I don't have time to talk about. But anyway, what's built on top of that is from 600, 700 years later. Now, here are your destruction options. Let's talk to what Ami Mazar was thinking about, not being able to analyze these proper destructions in the way they should be. Warfare. You can have a fire, you can have a generalized fire, you can have a localized fire, you can have earthquakes, you can have floods, you can have tsunamis, you can have volcanism. Now, in the Jordan Valley, we don't particularly have to worry about tsunamis much, but by the way, the site is 500 feet below sea level. But these are the general destruction options. Now, why in the world did I come up with this list? Because, as an archaeologist, being challenged by another archaeologist to say, nobody's ever developed a systematic way of analyzing destruction layers. Well, that bugged me, so I did. So I started to develop some ideas, some protocols, some systematization of this whole thing. Now, I'm going to only give you two. I'm going to run through two sets of earthquake proxies, typical proxies, and for two kinds of destruction layers, one earthquake, and we'll see what the next one is. And then I'm going to show you a whole bunch of others. I'm not going to read them, but I'm going to go through these real quick just to give you an idea. Site-wide architectural damage, brick fall directionality, brickstone scatter on functional surfaces, evidence of burning or not, objects on floors in situ, pottery on floors intact or broken in place, skeletal remains on surfaces or not, maybe they got scared and ran out. Typically 50 centimeters or so up to 1 meter of destruction matrix, post-event collapse and disintegration or not, depending upon if they re-inhabited it quickly. And a hiatus with sediment deposition or not, depending upon the post-event scenario. Warfare, okay, warfare, I gave you that as a second one. Burning or not, collapse of architecture or not, objects on floors in situ. It sounds very familiar, doesn't it? Pottery on floors, intact or broken, objects, pottery removed or not, skeletal remains of slain or not, siege phenomena or not, post-action disintegration or not, depending upon how fast it was rebuilt. So these are the kinds of things you can put together and look for that are, we would say, typical proxies of destruction events. Now, I went on to give you fire local, floods, tsunamis, volcanism. By the way, there's no volcanism in the Jordan Valley, not in historical times. And so there. Now, here's the lower city at el-Hammam. Do you see walls? Do you see that wall? See? It's falling in a northeast direction. It's the only wall stub that's actually preserved that we excavated on the lower city. All the other mud bricks have been literally stripped off their stone foundations, and some of the stones on the stone foundation heat fractured. But here's the rubble underneath, so I don't have time to explain what all the numbers mean. Here is a jar over in the middle of the city. Now, it is intact. We thought it was floating 2 or 3 centimeters across the floor. We re-excavated, opened up this whole area this season, and we have found that this jar is actually floating 30 centimeters off the floor. It's also tilted to the northeast. This is a brick. Here are brick pieces. Here's pottery pieces. And so it was at one time airborne in the matrix. And again, here you see this is a foundation that's been built, middle bronze. This is the floor area here, and this is the destruction matrix. You can even see stones as larger stones, cobbles as part of the destruction matrix. Here's the only vessels that up to this point in the palace that was found on the floor. It's on the opposite side it's on the northeast face of a wall. It's protected on the northeast face of a wall. Everything else is missing from the floor. That yellow line represents the shear line of all the mud bricks. So we've removed so much of the mud brick here to see the stone. Here's the mud brick. Here's the original height of the mud brick up to here. It's all stripped off at that level. And then you have some subsequent minor amount of detritus from decomposing mud bricks. But here's what you get across the site. Vessels exploded and strewn into the matrix going from a southwest to a northeast direction. You have larger chunks of debris and material here. Here you have, this is between the walls, you have pieces of brick up, down, every which kind of orientation, all moving in a southwest to northeast direction. We have some pancaking of stuff that flew in from some higher story and landed. These were probably large tapestries or rugs that, again, just charred, burned away, and left cavities in the matrix. Here's a piece of a vessel landing on a piece of wood. Here's a chunk of a wood beam. Here are jars, and by the way, from here down to here, it's about a meter. It's about a meter this way, but look here's a jar here. Here's actually a cooking pot. Here's a jar, here's a jar, here's a jar. They're all smashed, but they're all at different levels. In other words, they were all at one time for just a brief moment airborne in the matrix and all landed at different places. Here's another jar. Again, pieces of it, but you never find the whole jar. Melted bricks. We have buckets of this stuff. Melted bricks. You see the bubbling, the off-gassing, creating a sort of a lava look here. Melted bricks. Here you have the destruction matrix. I like this. Here's barley. Here's pottery. Here's a mud brick. Here's plaster. All kinds of stuff just churned up into the matrix. And of course, we test this stuff. We have dozens and dozens now radiocarbon dates on the destruction matrix, and it centers right around 1700 BC plus minus 50. We have one lab that consistently comes in 100 years later, but I really don't care. It doesn't matter to me. I don't care what the destruction date is. Anyway, but you see pieces of floor, pieces of plaster. This is an Iron Age foundation that's protruding down. But all of this is just destruction. Here's a Middle Bronze Age oven, and all of this stuff is just flying in over the top of it. Here's a piece of a mud brick. Now, this is really interesting. Now, this is north is this is a north balk. North is that way. This is going to the northeast. But I want to show you, let's tighten up on this. I want you to look at this stuff. This is chunky mud brick stuff and chunky stuff down here that's heavier. This is all fine particulates being blown over the top of this wall. The wall was sheared off, and then you have a remaining, I call it blowover. I'm just looking at this going, yeah, it looks like it's just coming right over and it's just landing and almost looking like a lamination on this other side. The key to this whole thing is that this entire matrix from the top of it to the bottom of it is a single event matrix. And it's proven by the pottery. The pottery is strewn here. You can see a vessel here, another piece of it here. This is a cooking vessel, this is a serving vessel, and they're all smashed together, moving in a southwest and northeast direction. We call this the flying casserole. See that plaster line? That is the plaster line, and this thing is sitting 30 centimeters off the floor, smashed into 100 pieces, surrounded by matrix, so it didn't blow up. It's surrounded by this moving matrix, but it's smashed against that wall. Now, I'm just going to go fast. There's a saddle cairn. This is just field drawings. There's a saddle cairn here, and there's pottery strewn all along this wall, moving in a southwest and northeast direction. That saddle cairn, hopefully I'll have a picture of it here in a second. It's right here in the drawing of the square just above it. Here's that saddle cairn. It has pottery going around it and smashing, and I'm talking about pottery from the same vessel. Here's the saddle cairn. It's 500 kilos. 500 kilos. That's a heavy stone. You see the grinding surface is here. It was rolled off its base 1/4 turn to the northeast. What could have rolled a stone? And my other archaeologists want to say, oh yeah, they must have wanted to clean it. So they rolled, right. It rolled, when astrophysicist Malcolm Lecomte saw this and then went up to see with his GPS, what direction he was facing, it was like light went off in his head. That was rolled by a powerful force, and all the pottery around it is being strewn over multiple meters, the same vessels. Now, here it is again once it's cleaned out. You can see the floor here. But I want to get, and by the way, the pottery's gorgeous. Here's one of our painted vessels. But I want to show you when the pottery lands, look at this scorch mark. Look at this piece, untouched. This piece is scorched, and this piece is scorched differently from the others. These are pieces that have been put back together, discovered in different seasons, in different places, and scorched differently based on where they landed. Look at these flash marks inside. Now, here's a join. This is what I'm talking about. How do we prove that this is a single event matrix? This chocolate on white crater, here's one piece, here's the other piece. Diagonally, it's about 8 meters. Boom. That's southwest and northeast directionality. And here it is. One piece is found at minus 132.35, the other at 131.87. They're not even found at the same level. They're up in the matrix, and that's southwest and northeast. Here's another one. Same vessel, chocolate on white jug. Here's the scatter. It's moving like that, and those three pieces are like that, and they are like this. One is 131.44, 131.80, another one minus 131.30. You see they're at different places in the matrix, and they're all moving in a southwest and northeast direction. Here's a chocolate on whiteware jug. By the way, we just found several more pieces of this that we didn't even know we had, and we put it in. It would even make the distance longer. But look at this; it's all moving in a southwest and northeast direction. Now look at the scatter. Look at the scatter where it's found. This piece is found at 132.07. Here's 133.27, 132.96, on and on and on and on. This stuff is stretched over 1 meter vertically in the matrix and over 21 meters horizontally. This is same event matrix moving in a southwest and northeast direction. Here's that jar. We started putting it back together, and you can see the different scorch marks on it. It's really interesting. Look at this. Untouched, 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 scorch, scorch, scorch. And there it is. Where does all this come from? And I'm going to close with this. People. People crushed, their skulls crushed. What's going on here? I'll tell you what's going on here. This, by the way, that's where the skulls were found, right at between the city wall and the palace wall. And the bones of these individuals, and they may not be two individuals, maybe multiple individuals, are strewn throughout the matrix vertically like this. And so, here we have scant or no mud bricks, 100-foot high rampart, and mud bricks standing on their foundations behind that rampart. What just happened? That's directionality. All this got a direct hit from something, denuded all the bricks off. The mud bricks were preserved to the height of the rampart here. It's pretty telling. Now, here are the atypical proxies, and I'll close with this. Deep mixed matrix, mostly random frags, bricks, burnt wood, plaster, pottery, objects, human bones, miscellaneous debris. Frequently vitrified pottery, bricks, plaster, evidence of temps in excess of 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, in some cases more than 8,000 degrees. Massive quantities of ash, including, and I'm not even going to go there, only heavy objects on floors, pushed often out of living position, sheared off mud brick superstructures, filled in between by the terminal destruction matrix. No intact or broken pottery in place on floors, thousands of fragments from different vessels strewn in a southwest to northeast pattern or in suspension in clusters, many joins variously scorched, evidence of post-event disintegration virtually absent, 600 to 700 year occupational hiatus across the entire Kikar, and that goes for all the sites associated with el-Hammam, no less than 26 bolide airburst microproxies in the terminal destruction matrix, not found in the strata above or below. That's all I have to say about that.